There are probably few people who haven't seen Catch Me If You Can, the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. Many of you also know that this film was based on the true story of Frank Abagnale, the famous con man who forged checks and changed identities like other people change socks. But how much truth was actually in that film? What was myth and what was an outright lie? Here's the thing that's going to blow your mind today. What if the making of a movie about a con artist turned out to be the result of yet another con by Frank Abagnale himself? What if the greatest scam this man ever pulled wasn't cashing fake checks or impersonating a pilot, but convincing the entire world, including Steven Spielberg and millions of moviegoers, that he was a criminal mastermind when in reality he was just a small-time crook with a big imagination? Welcome to the story of Frank Abagnale Jr., a man who might have conned his way into history by lying about how good he was at conning. Let's start with what we all think we know. The legend, the story that captured our imagination and made us root for a criminal because, let's be honest, he made it look so damn cool. Picture this. It's the 1960s. America is still relatively innocent, trusting. A young man walks through an airport in a crisp Pan Am pilot's uniform, aviator sunglasses perched perfectly on his face. He's confident, charming, impossibly smooth. He boards flights without paying, stays in fancy hotels, dates beautiful stewardesses, and cashes millions of dollars in fake checks. He's 16 to 21 years old during all of this. Just a kid, really. But he's outsmarting banks, corporations, and even the FBI. That's the story we know. That's the story that became a best-selling book in 1980, and then a blockbuster movie in 2002. Leonardo DiCaprio dancing through hotel lobbies, Tom Hanks chasing him across the country, that iconic scene where Frank calls Carl on Christmas Eve from a phone booth. It's cinema magic. It's the American dream twisted into the American con. And we ate it up. But here's where things get interesting. In 2020, a science journalist named Alan C. Logan published a book called The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Catching Truth While We Can. And Logan didn't just poke a few holes in Abagnale's story. He took a sledgehammer to the entire foundation. Using court documents, prison records, newspaper archives, and interviews with actual victims, Logan built a case that the majority of Frank Abagnale's famous exploits never happened. Not the way he said they did anyway. Some didn't happen at all. So let's do something fun today. We're going to walk through Frank Abagnale's life twice. First, we'll tell you his version, the one from his autobiography and the movie, the legend. And then we're going to show you what actually happened based on documents, records, and evidence. We're going to compare the blockbuster to the boring truth. And by the end, you're going to have to ask yourself a question. Was Frank Abagnale a brilliant con artist, or was he a brilliant storyteller who turned a few petty crimes into a multi-million-dollar career? Let's dive in. Frank William Abagnale Jr. was born on April 27, 1948, in the Bronx, New York. His father, Frank Sr., was an Italian-American businessman who owned a stationery store. His mother, Paulette, was French, from Algeria, one of the Pieds Noirs. According to Frank's telling, his childhood was idyllic until it wasn't. His parents had money, status, respect in the community. But when Frank was 12, his parents separated. By the time he was 15, they were divorced. And that's when, according to Frank, everything went sideways. In his memoir, Frank paints his father as this larger-than-life figure, a man he desperately wanted to impress, a man he loved deeply. When his parents' marriage fell apart, Frank says he was caught in the middle, used as a pawn. It messed him up. And that's when he committed his first crime, and the victim was his own father. Frank Sr. gave his teenage son a gasoline credit card and a truck so he could drive to a part-time job. Pretty standard dad move, but young Frank saw an opportunity. He started making deals with gas station attendants. He'd use the card to buy car parts and supplies, way more than he needed. Then he'd return the stuff for cash, splitting the money with the station employees. His father would get a bill for gasoline he never actually received. Over 3 months, Frank ran up a bill of $3,400. That's over 30 grand in today's money. At 15 years old. When his father found out, Frank says he was sent to a reform school in Westchester County, a Catholic institution for delinquent boys. He claims he spent time there, learned some hard lessons, but also learned how to be a better criminal. The reform school, he said, was his graduate program in deception. Here's the thing, though. Investigators haven't been able to confirm most of this. There's no record of Frank Abagnale attending the reform school he described. He also claimed in numerous interviews that he attended Iona Preparatory School, an elite Catholic private school in New Rochelle, through 10th grade until he was 16. Sounds impressive, right? Problem is, Alan Logan checked. Frank Abagnale doesn't appear in any of the Iona Prep yearbooks from that time. No photographs, no mention. And when Logan reached out to alumni from those years, none of them remembered a Frank Abagnale. Now, maybe that's not a big deal. Maybe he went there and just wasn't memorable. Or maybe, and this is where it gets interesting, Frank was already practicing his craft, making up credentials, creating a more impressive backstory. Because if you're going to sell yourself as a master con artist later in life, you need a good origin story, right? When Frank was 16, according to his version of events, he ran away from home. He couldn't handle the divorce, couldn't handle being pulled between his parents, so he left, took off for New York City with nothing but charm and ambition. And almost immediately, he says he started running cons. Small stuff at first, opening bank accounts under fake names, writing bad checks, disappearing before anyone could catch him. But he needed something bigger, something that would give him credibility, access, and most importantly, free transportation. That's when he came up with the Pan Am pilot scheme. And this, my friends, is the centerpiece of the legend. The moment that defines Frank Abagnale in popular culture. This is what we all remember from the movie. Leonardo DiCaprio, in that sharp uniform, walking through airports like he owns them, flashing a smile that could melt glaciers. Here's how Frank describes it in his book. He went to a uniform shop in Manhattan and purchased a Pan Am pilot's uniform using money from forged checks. He then called Pan Am's corporate office, pretending to be a pilot who had lost his ID, and convinced them to issue him a new one. Just like that. 16 years old, and he had the golden ticket. The uniform, he said, was magic. People see a pilot's uniform, and they see authority, expertise, trustworthiness. They don't ask questions. Frank claimed he used a system called deadheading, which is a real thing in the airline industry. When pilots or flight crew need to get from one city to another for work, they can ride in the cockpit jump seat for free. So Frank would show up at airports, looking sharp in his uniform, and tell the gate agents he was a Pan Am pilot deadheading to another city. They'd wave him through. He'd sit in the cockpit, chat with the real pilots, sometimes even flip the autopilot switch when they stepped out to use the bathroom. He said he never actually flew a plane, but he got really good at looking like he could. According to Frank, this scam lasted for years. He claimed he flew over 2 million miles, visited 26 countries, logged over 250 flights, all before he turned 21. He stayed in fancy hotels that gave airline crew discounts. He ate at expensive restaurants. He dated stewardesses, dozens of them. And whenever he needed cash, he'd forge Pan Am payroll checks and cash them at banks. He claimed he cashed over 17,000 fake checks, totaling $2.5 million, $2.5 million, in the 1960s. That's nearly 20 million today. The movie shows this as a glamorous adventure. DiCaprio's Frank is always one step ahead, always improvising, always escaping by the skin of his teeth. There's that scene where he's in a hotel room, surrounded by stewardesses he's recruited for a fake training program. There's the moment where he confidently walks through airport security while FBI agents are literally feet away. It's thrilling. It's fun. We're rooting for him because he's not hurting anyone, right? He's just scamming big corporations and banks. Robin Hood with a briefcase. But here's where the legend expands even further. Frank didn't just pretend to be a pilot. Oh no. He claimed he took on multiple identities, each more audacious than the last. At one point, he said, he posed as a pediatrician at a hospital in Georgia. Not just any doctor, but a supervising pediatrician at Cobb General Hospital in Marietta. He claimed he worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, supervising 7 residents and 42 nurses for a whole year, at 18 years old. How did he pull this off? According to Frank, he had a photographic memory. He'd go to the university library and memorize medical textbooks and journals. He couldn't comprehend the material, but he could rattle it off verbatim. And since he was a supervisor, not a practicing physician, he didn't have to actually perform medical procedures. He just had to look like he knew what he was doing. He'd make rounds, scribble notes on clipboards, initial charts, and everyone assumed he was legit. For an entire year, he said, no one questioned him. Then there's the lawyer story. Frank claimed that while posing as a TWA pilot, he told a stewardess he was dating that he was actually a Harvard law student. She introduced him to a lawyer friend who mentioned that Louisiana needed more attorneys. So Frank, ever the opportunist, decided to become one. He forged a Harvard Law School transcript and applied to take the Louisiana bar exam. He failed twice, but on the third try, after 8 weeks of intense studying, he passed. He then got a job as an assistant attorney general in Louisiana, working in the corporate law division. He claimed he worked there for nearly a year, closing 33 cases. Oh, and there's more. He said he also posed as a sociology professor at Brigham Young University in Utah for 2 semesters, teaching college students with a forged Columbia University degree. Because why not? If you're gonna lie, lie big. The movie doesn't show all of these identities in detail, but it gives you the flavor. DiCaprio's Frank slips in and out of roles like changing costumes, doctor, lawyer, professor, pilot. He's a chameleon, a genius, a modern-day catch-me-if-you-can Renaissance man of crime. And then there's the FBI. Enter Carl Hanratty, played by Tom Hanks in the film. In the movie, Carl is the dogged FBI agent who becomes obsessed with catching Frank. They play this cat-and-mouse game for years. There's that famous scene in a hotel where Frank, using the alias Barry Allen, convinces Carl that he's actually an FBI agent too, that they're on the same side hunting for Frank Abagnale. Carl falls for it. Frank escapes, but Carl keeps coming. He's always right behind Frank, always just a step too late. They develop this weird respect for each other. That Christmas phone call, where Frank, lonely and desperate, calls Carl just to hear a friendly voice. It's humanizing. It makes you care about both of them. According to Frank's autobiography, this chase went on for 5 years. The FBI, led by an agent he later named as Joseph Shea, pursued him across the United States and eventually to Europe. Frank claimed he was wanted in multiple countries, that his face was in airports around the world, that he was on the FBI's most wanted list. He was, in his own words, the youngest person ever added to that list. But Frank was slippery. He claimed he had multiple narrow escapes. At one point, according to his book, he was arrested and put on a plane back to the United States. But while the plane was taxiing at JFK Airport in New York, Frank executed one of the most daring escapes in criminal history. He went to the bathroom, removed the toilet apparatus, squeezed himself through the narrow opening, dropped down into the lower hatch, swung down onto the tarmac, and ran across the runway. He hailed a cab and disappeared into the night. The whole escape, he said, happened without anyone hearing a thing because of the roar of the engines. Just like that. Vanished. The movie doesn't show that exact escape, but it has its own dramatic version. And we believe it because, come on, it's Frank Abagnale. If anyone could pull off a toilet escape from a taxiing plane, it's him. Eventually, though, in 1969, Frank's luck ran out. He was arrested in Montpellier, France. By that time, investigators from 12 countries, including the United States, wanted him for fraud. He was 21 years old. His run, he said, was over. Frank served time in a harsh French prison in Perpignan, then was extradited to Sweden, where he served more time in Malmö, and finally he was sent back to the United States. In April 1971, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for forgery. But here's the kicker. According to Frank, he didn't serve the full sentence. After just a few years, the FBI pulled him out. They made him an offer. Work for us, help us catch other con artists, and we'll let you out early. He became a consultant, an expert in fraud prevention. He started Abagnale & Associates, a security consulting firm that still exists today. He wrote books about fraud. He gave speeches around the world, commanding fees of $20,000 to $30,000 per appearance. He married, had 3 kids, and settled down in Charleston, South Carolina. The legend of Frank Abagnale became the redemption of Frank Abagnale. The con artist turned good guy. the thief who became the protector. It's a perfect American story. Crime doesn't pay, but if you're charming enough and smart enough, you can turn your past into a lucrative career as a cautionary tale. And we believed it. All of it. For decades. Until some people started asking questions. The first cracks in Frank Abagnale's story appeared surprisingly early, but nobody really paid attention. See, Frank started telling his story publicly in the late 1970s. In 1977, he appeared on a game show called To Tell the Truth. You know the format. 3 people all claim to be the same person, and a panel of celebrities has to guess which one is telling the truth. Frank appeared as himself, the famous conman, and even then, he was spinning tales about being a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, about escaping from prison. The audience loved it. The next year, 1978, he was a guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. By this point, Frank had refined his pitch. He was charming, self-deprecating, funny. He had great stories. Johnny ate it up. The audience ate it up. But here's the thing. Not everyone was buying it. A journalist named Stephen Hall from the San Francisco Chronicle did something radical. He actually tried to verify Frank's claims. He started making phone calls. Banks, schools, hospitals, airlines, all the places Frank said he'd conned. And guess what? Nobody had any record of Frank Abagnale under any of his supposed aliases. No evidence of his cons. When Hall confronted Frank about this, Frank's response was essentially, well, these institutions are too embarrassed to admit they were conned, so of course they're not going to confirm it. Or, he said maybe he changed the names of the places in his story. In December 1978, another journalist, Ira Perry from the Daily Oklahoman, did his own investigation. Perry contacted Pan Am directly and spoke to their spokesman, Bruce Haxthausen. And Haxthausen's response was brutal. He said, "This is the first we've heard of this, and we would have remembered it if it had happened. You don't forget $2.5 million in bad checks. This guy is as phony as a $3 bill." Think about that for a second. Pan Am, the airline Frank supposedly scammed for millions, had never heard of him. Perry also tracked down FBI agents who allegedly worked on Frank's case. One of them was Robert Russ Frank, who Frank and his publicist had been name-dropping for years, claiming Frank was the Atlanta FBI agent who knew all about Frank's crimes. When Perry finally reached Frank, who had just retired as head of the FBI's Houston division, Frank said, "That damn Abagnale uses my name all over the place, but I've never even met the guy." Another FBI agent, Eugene Stewart, who was head of the Atlanta division when Frank claimed he was working as a pediatrician there, told Perry that Frank was just a low-level criminal. Nothing special. More of a harassment than anything else. But here's the fascinating part. Despite these journalists publishing their findings, despite the evidence that Frank's story didn't add up, nothing really happened. Frank kept giving speeches, he kept telling his stories. And in 1980, he published his autobiography, Catch Me If You Can, co-written with Stan Redding. The book was a hit. It had everything. Adventure, crime, romance, redemption. It read like a thriller novel. Because, as it turns out, that's essentially what it was. Now, years later, when journalists started really digging into the discrepancies, Frank had an explanation ready. He posted a statement on his company's website in 2002, right around when the Spielberg movie came out. He said, "I was only interviewed by my co-writer about 4 times. He did a great job telling the story, but he also over-dramatized and exaggerated some things. That was his style and what the editor wanted. He was just telling a story, not writing my biography. Convenient, right? Blame the co-writer. Except there's a problem with that explanation." Frank had been telling these exact same stories on national television in 1977, 3 years before the book was even published. On To Tell the Truth in The Tonight Show, Frank personally claimed he worked as a doctor for a year, as a lawyer for a year, that he escaped from prison multiple times, that he cashed millions in fake checks. These weren't Stan Redding's exaggerations. These were Frank's own words on camera before the book existed. In fact, investigative journalist Javier Leyva later discovered an obscure magazine article from January 1978 in True Detective magazine where Frank told his entire life story to Stan Redding before they even started working on the book together. In that article, Frank made all the same grandiose claims. The bar exam, the assistant attorney general job, the sociology professor gig, the pediatrician role, the prison escapes, the 2.5 million in checks. It was all Frank, not Stan Redding's embellishments. Frank invented these stories, and he'd been selling them for years. But in the late 70s and early 80s, before the internet, before easy access to public records, it was hard for the average person to fact-check any of this. Frank was charismatic, he had a great story, and honestly, people wanted to believe him. We love a good redemption arc. We love the idea that a criminal can turn his life around and become a force for good. So, even though some journalists were skeptical, Frank's legend kept growing. Universities started booking him for speaking engagements. He commanded big fees. He was a celebrity. But then, in 1981, things got a little messy. A criminal justice professor named William Toney and his students at some university decided to actually verify Frank's biographical claims. They dug into court records, contacted institutions, interviewed people, and they found the same thing those earlier journalists had found. Frank's stories didn't match reality. Several universities started canceling Frank's appearances. The University of South Carolina asked Frank to sign an affidavit attesting to the truthfulness of his claims. They told him he could still give his speech and collect his fee even if he didn't sign, but they would warn students up front that he hadn't promised to tell the truth. Frank refused to sign. He called the affidavit a slap in the face. Other schools started canceling too. And Frank, in a moment of what might be self-awareness, or maybe just smart PR, wrote a letter to Georgia Southwestern State University canceling all his college speaking engagements. In the letter, he said it was wrong to profit from his criminal past by speaking about it to young, impressionable minds. Very noble. Except he didn't stop giving speeches. He just stopped going to colleges. He kept doing corporate events, security conferences, anywhere else that would pay him. When a journalist asked him directly if his biography was a lie, Frank gave one of the most revealing answers of his life. He said, "Well, then I am the world's greatest con man. If I didn't do all those things and I've made all this money from book advances, royalties, and speaking fees, then I am in fact the world's greatest con man." It's almost like he was telling us the truth right there, and we just didn't want to hear it. For years, this was where things stood. Some people believed Frank, some people were skeptical, but there wasn't enough hard evidence to completely debunk him. And then, in 2002, Steven Spielberg's movie came out, and suddenly Frank Abagnale was everywhere again. Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks brought his story to a whole new generation. The movie was a massive hit, and Frank loved it. He did interviews, he made a cameo in the film, playing a French police officer. He soaked in the attention. When asked how accurate the movie was, Frank said it was about 80% true, with most of the changes being about his family life and some of the specific ways he avoided capture. 80%. That's pretty accurate for a Hollywood movie, right? Except it wasn't. Not even close. Because in 2020, Alan C. Logan dropped a bomb. Logan is a science journalist from Northern Ireland, and he became fascinated with Frank Abagnale's story. But unlike most people, Logan didn't just accept the legend. He decided to investigate. For years, Logan dug through archives, court documents, prison records, old newspapers, anything he could find. He tracked down people who knew Frank back in the 60s. He interviewed victims, real people who'd been scammed by Frank. He built a timeline based on verifiable facts, not Frank's stories. And what he found was stunning. Logan published his findings in a book called The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Catching Truth While We Can. And the title tells you everything you need to know. Logan's conclusion, based on extensive documentation, is that the majority of Frank Abagnale's famous story is fabricated. Not exaggerated, not dramatized, fabricated, made up, a hoax. Let's start with the most important piece of evidence. Prison records. According to the New York State Archives, Frank William Abagnale Jr. was an inmate at Great Meadow Correctional Facility in Comstock, New York, from July 26, 1965 until December 24, 1968. Inmate number 25,367. He was 17 years old when he went in, 20 years old when he got out. Now, here's why that matters. During those exact years, 1965 to 1968, Frank claims he was flying around the world as a Pan Am pilot, cashing millions in fake checks, living in fancy hotels, dating stewardesses, working as a doctor in Georgia. But he wasn't. He was in prison, in New York, the entire time. Think about that. The core of Frank Abagnale's legend, the years he claims to have committed his most spectacular crimes, he was actually locked up in a state prison, serving time for stealing blank checks from a gas station in Tuckahoe, New York. That's what he was convicted of. Not millions in fraud, not international cons, stealing checks from a gas station. So when did Frank actually impersonate a pilot? According to Logan's research and documented evidence, Frank briefly posed as a TWA pilot, not Pan Am, for a few weeks after he got out of prison in late 1968. Not years, weeks. And during those weeks, he wasn't globetrotting to 26 countries. He was stalking a flight attendant named Paula Parks. Paula Parks was a real person, a TWA stewardess, and her story is nothing like the romantic subplot in the movie. According to Paula, Frank followed her from airport to airport, figured out her schedule through deceptive means, and essentially stalked her. He was obsessed. When he finally met her family in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, they welcomed him. Paula's mother fell in love with him. He was charming, polite, seemed like a nice young man. He told them he was a furloughed TWA pilot and a social worker with a master's degree from Ithaca College. He stayed with the family for about 6 weeks, and then he stole $1,200 from them using forged checks and disappeared. In a 2023 interview with the New York Post, Paula Parks Campbell, as she's now known, said the one thing that still bothers her about Frank's story is his claim that he never hurt little people, that he only went after big corporations. She said, "That's the one that sticks in my craw. My mama's heart was broken." This is important because it shows the real impact of Frank's crimes. These weren't victimless cons against faceless corporations. He stole from ordinary families who showed him kindness. Paula Parks' family trusted him, welcomed him into their home, and he repaid that trust by robbing them. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Court documents show that Frank was arrested multiple times in multiple states. In February 1965, just before his first prison sentence, he was arrested in Mount Vernon, New York, for petty larceny. A month later, he was arrested again for impersonating a police officer. He went to an apartment building, knocked on a woman's door, claimed to be a Scarsdale police officer investigating her teenage daughter. The woman got suspicious, called the real police, and they found Frank with a toy gun and a paper police badge. He was arrested, booked on a vagrancy charge, and ordered by the court to be committed to a psychiatric hospital for observation. In June 1965, the FBI arrested Frank in Eureka, California, for stealing a Ford Mustang from one of his father's neighbors. That's when he was sentenced to 3 years in New York State Prison. After he got out in December 1968, and after his brief stint impersonating a pilot, Frank was arrested again in Baton Rouge in February 1969. He was convicted in June and sentenced to 12 years of supervised probation. But instead of serving that probation, he fled to Europe. In September 1969, Frank was arrested in France. He served 4 months in a French prison, was extradited to Sweden where he served 2 more months, and then was sent back to the United States. In November 1970, back in the U.S., Frank was arrested in Cobb County, Georgia, for forging 10 Pan Am payroll checks across 5 states. The total amount? $1,448.60, not $2.5 million, less than $1,500. In today's money, that's about $13,000. That's what he was actually convicted of. In April 1971, Frank was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Petersburg, Virginia. And contrary to his claims about escaping from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, the Bureau of Prisons confirmed that Frank was never housed in Atlanta. Never admitted, which means he couldn't have escaped from there. When a reporter asked the acting warden about Frank's claimed escape, the warden said he was never admitted, so I don't really see how he could have escaped. Frank was released on parole in February 1974 after serving about 2 years. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Frank claimed that he went straight to work for the FBI as part of a special deal. But in August 1974, just 6 months after his release, Frank was arrested again. This time for stealing cameras from a children's summer camp in Friendswood, Texas, where he'd gotten a job by pretending to be a pilot. He was arrested, fined, and released. Shortly after that, he got another job at an orphanage in the Houston area by claiming to be a pilot with a master's degree. His role was finding foster homes for children. When his parole officer found out about Frank's lies, the officer moved Frank into an apartment above his own garage so he could keep an eye on him. Then Frank got a job at Aetna Insurance, where he was fired and later sued for check fraud after allegedly cashing bad personal checks during his employee training. So much for working with the FBI, right? Now let's talk about those famous professional impersonations. The doctor, the lawyer, the professor. Did Frank actually do any of these things? Let's start with the lawyer story because it's the easiest to debunk. Frank claimed he passed the Louisiana bar exam and worked as an assistant attorney general for nearly a year. In 1978, after Frank made this claim on television, the Louisiana State Bar Association decided to check. They reconciled all records of everyone who took the bar exam during the relevant time period. They checked under Frank's real name and known aliases. Result? Frank Abagnale never took the Louisiana bar exam, never passed it, never failed it, never sat for it. The State Attorney General's office also examined all payment records for employees during the time Frank claimed to work there. No Frank Abagnale under his real name or any alias. He never worked there. After Frank appeared on The Tonight Show, the first Assistant Attorney General of Louisiana at the time, Kenneth C. DeJean, gave a reporter a list of questions to ask Frank about the Attorney General he claimed to have worked for, Jack Gramillion. Basic questions that anyone who actually worked in that office would know. Frank failed to answer them correctly. DeJean's statement was blunt. The man is not an imposter. He is a liar. What about the doctor story? Frank claimed he worked as a supervising pediatrician at Cobb General Hospital in Marietta, Georgia, for a year when he was 18. He said he worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, supervising 7 residents and 42 nurses. When journalists from the Daily Oklahoman investigated this in 1978, hospital administrators told them the hospital had no midnight to 8 a.m. shift during that time period. The position of regular overnight pediatrician didn't exist. It never had. And remember, prison records show that when Frank was 18, he was locked up in Great Meadow Prison in New York, not working in a Georgia hospital. But here's where it gets creepy, and this is important because it's one of the few things Frank actually did do. In 1970, after he got out of prison and was impersonating a TWA pilot, Frank went to the University of Arizona campus. He told people he was a pilot and a doctor recruiting stewardesses for Pan Am. He said he needed to conduct physical examinations on female students who wanted to join the program. And he did. He performed physical exams on at least 12 young women. He's openly bragged about this in interviews, saying things like, "When the girls came by, I always gave them a thorough examination and sent them on their way. I was young, but not stupid." Let that sink in. A 22-year-old con artist with no medical training convinced college women to let him perform physical examinations on them under false pretenses. That's not a clever con. That's sexual assault. In 2021, Robert Mann, a journalism professor at Louisiana State University who had interviewed Frank years earlier, expressed deep regret for not challenging Frank on this. Mann said, "Looking back on what I wrote, I am embarrassed. Reading Abagnale brag about sexual abuse makes me sick." And none of those women were ever actually enrolled in any stewardess program because the program didn't exist. It was all a lie to get access to them. As for the sociology professor claim at Brigham Young University, there's no evidence Frank ever taught there. In 2006, a journalist named Scott Hawes from KSL in Utah confronted Frank about this claim. Frank initially said he couldn't recall the details and blamed his co-writer for exaggerating. When Hawes showed Frank his own words from his book and from the movie credits, where Frank personally claimed to be a BYU professor, Frank backpedaled and said maybe he was just a guest lecturer. So we've got prison records proving Frank was locked up during his supposed crime spree. We've got professional organizations confirming he never passed the bar, never worked as an attorney. We've got hospital records showing the position he claimed to hold didn't exist. We've got no evidence of him teaching at BYU. What about those other famous stories? The toilet escape from the plane at JFK. Aviation experts say it's physically impossible. The toilet system on aircraft is a sealed, pressurized unit. You can't remove the apparatus and squeeze through. The opening isn't large enough, and even if it were, there's no lower hatch to drop through. The whole story defies the laws of physics and aircraft design. When Frank first told this story in 1978 to a reporter from the Honolulu Advertiser, he said he moved the sewage container aside, squeezed through, swung down, landed on the pavement, and ran across the runway. The reporter wrote it up. Nobody fact-checked it, and the story became legend. The escape from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where Frank claimed he impersonated a prison inspector, we already covered this. The Bureau of Prisons confirmed Frank was never housed there. Can't escape from a place you never were. What about being on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list? Frank claimed for years that he was the youngest person ever added to that list. He said it in speeches, in interviews, in his book. When the Spielberg movie was being promoted in 2002, the marketing materials included this claim. But when journalists checked the actual FBI 10 Most Wanted list, Frank's name doesn't appear anywhere. Ever. When confronted with this evidence, Frank quietly admitted on his website that he was never on the FBI's Most Wanted list. But by then, millions of people had already seen the movie and believed it was true. Let's talk about the FBI relationship, because this is crucial to Frank's entire redemption narrative. In the movie, and in Frank's telling, the FBI pulled him out of prison early as part of a special deal. They recognized his genius and wanted him to help catch other criminals. Frank claims he's worked with the FBI for over 40 years. In speeches as recently as 2018, he said things like, "The FBI always asks me when I'm going to retire because they don't want me to." He's claimed to work as an ethics instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico. He's described being sent on clandestine missions by FBI Director Clarence Kelly in the 1970s, infiltrating military bases as a fake lieutenant to gather intelligence on missile systems, going to secret labs in New Mexico disguised as a scientist. These are extraordinary claims. And you know what they say about extraordinary claims? They require extraordinary evidence. So where's the evidence? Well, there isn't any. The FBI has never made an official statement confirming any of Frank's work with them. Not once. Not ever. When the Spielberg movie came out and its marketing materials claimed Frank had received commendations from the FBI, an FBI spokesperson clarified that Frank had given lectures at the Academy from time to time, but denied he'd been given any commendations. Jerry Williams, a retired FBI agent who specialized in white-collar crime and fraud, spoke to investigative journalist Javier Leiva about Frank's claims of working directly with FBI Director Kelly on secret missions. Williams was blunt. If anybody tells you that they got an assignment directly from the FBI director right from the head of the FBI, you know for a fact it's bullshit. It doesn't happen that way. Era Winkler, a former intelligence analyst for the U.S. Department of Defense and chief security architect for Walmart, described meeting Frank at a conference. Winkler asked Frank about his specific position at the FBI. Frank responded that he was a special agent. Winkler, skeptical, asked, "You mean a full-fledged special agent?" Frank said yes. But there's no record of Frank Abagnale ever being an FBI special agent. That's a specific position with specific requirements, training, and documentation. You can't just claim to be one. In 2022, investigative journalist Javier Leiva tracked down Alan Brown, a retired FBI agent who was involved in Frank's arrest in Georgia in 1970. Brown got permission from FBI headquarters to speak publicly about the arrest. According to Brown, there was no manhunt, no years-long chase, no cat-and-mouse game. The Atlanta FBI field office simply received a teletype, basically a message, saying Frank Abagnale was staying at the Squire Inn in Marietta, Georgia. Brown and other agents went to the hotel and arrested him in his room without incident. No dramatic escape, no chase, just a routine arrest based on a tip. And what about Joseph Shea, the FBI agent who supposedly became Frank's friend and mentor, the inspiration for Tom Hanks's character in the movie? Frank claimed for years that Shea pursued him for 5 years and then befriended him during his parole. But according to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Frank and Shea didn't actually meet until the late 1980s, almost 20 years after Frank's arrest. They ran into each other at an anti-crime seminar in Kansas City. Frank recognized Shea and went over to shake his hand. That was their first meeting. No years-long chase, no Christmas phone calls, none of it. So if Frank wasn't being chased by the FBI, if he wasn't working with them on secret missions, if he wasn't an FBI special agent or an ethics instructor, what was he doing? He was building a business. Abagnale and Associates, founded in 1976, is a real company that consults on fraud prevention and secure documents. Frank does give lectures, including occasional talks at the FBI Academy as a guest speaker, which is very different from being an employee or an agent, and he makes a lot of money doing it. His speaking fees have been reported to be between $20,000 and $30,000 per appearance. He's written multiple books. He got paid for the rights to his autobiography when it was adapted into a movie. In 1991, Frank and his wife Kelly filed for bankruptcy in Tulsa, Oklahoma, claiming $1.6 million in debts. But he bounced back. In a 1988 speech, he claimed his company did $10.5 million of business per year, with 90% of it from the federal government. Frank has also claimed in many interviews that he's made millions from patents on secure check designs. But the United States Patent and Trademark Office has no patents listed under Frank Abagnale's name, either as an individual or through his company. The only connection is that some check security patents mention in their background sections that KPMG and Abagnale and Associates are among the groups that acknowledge check fraud is a problem. That's it. Being mentioned in a patent's background section is not the same as holding a patent. Frank even claimed to have an IQ of 140 and a photographic memory. In 2021, he was invited to speak at the American Mensa Conference in Houston, an organization for people with high IQs. The conference organizers promoted him as the subject of an FBI manhunt who cashed millions in fake checks while impersonating a pilot and doctor. But when a USA Today journalist asked Frank about specific details of his movements and crimes in the 1960s, Frank's response was, "You get to a point in your life where you go, I don't remember what I did. So much for that photographic memory." By the way, in 2022, Google did something very unusual. They added a disclaimer to Frank's talks at Google Video, which is still on YouTube. The disclaimer says, Google does not endorse or condone the content contained within this video, nor does it lay claim to the validity of the actions described herein. That's a pretty serious disclaimer for a company that hosts thousands of talks. It essentially says, we're not vouching for anything this guy says, but we're leaving the video up for historical purposes. They also disabled all comments on the video. So let's step back and do a reality check. Let's compare what the movie shows us versus what actually happened, based on documented evidence. In the movie, Frank Abagnale is an only child whose parents divorce, devastating him and setting him on his path to crime. In reality, Frank was one of 4 children. He had 2 brothers and a sister. In the movie, Frank runs away at 16 and immediately begins his incredible 5-year crime spree from 1963 to 1968, impersonating a pilot, cashing millions in checks, and outsmarting everyone. In reality, Frank was arrested multiple times between 1965 and 1969 for petty crimes. He spent most of those years in prison, not flying around the world. In the movie, Frank impersonates a Pan Am pilot for years, flying to dozens of countries, staying in luxury hotels, living the high life. In reality, Frank briefly impersonated a TWA pilot for a few weeks in late 1968 and early 1969. He didn't fly to 26 countries. He followed a flight attendant around the eastern United States and stole from her family. In the movie, Frank forges and cashes millions of dollars in fake checks, becoming one of the most successful check fraudsters in history. In reality, Frank was convicted of forging 10 Pan Am payroll checks totaling less than $1,500. That's the documented amount of his federal conviction. In the movie, Frank works as a supervising pediatrician at a hospital in Georgia, charming everyone with his fake medical knowledge. In reality, there's no evidence he ever worked at a hospital. But he did pose as a doctor to perform physical examinations on college women, which is sexual assault, not a clever con. In the movie, Frank passes the Louisiana bar exam and works as an assistant attorney general, impressing his colleagues with his legal acumen. In reality, Louisiana authorities confirmed he never took the bar exam and never worked in the attorney general's office. In the movie, Frank is pursued for years by FBI agent Carl Hanratty, played by Tom Hanks. They develop a complex relationship, with Frank calling Carl on Christmas Eve, lonely and desperate for connection. In reality, Carl Hanratty never existed. The character is loosely based on Joseph Shea, an FBI agent who arrested Frank once in 1970 and didn't meet him again until the 1980s at a conference. In the movie, Frank escapes from FBI custody multiple times, including a daring escape from a plane and another from a federal prison. In reality, Frank was never housed in the Atlanta federal prison he claimed to escape from, and the toilet escape from a plane is physically impossible, according to aviation experts. In the movie, Frank is on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, making him one of the most notorious criminals in America. In reality, Frank was never on that list. The FBI confirmed this. In the movie, the FBI makes a deal with Frank, pulling him out of prison early to work with them catching other con artists. In reality, Frank was released on standard parole after serving about 2 years of a 12-year sentence. There's no documented evidence of any special FBI deal, and Frank was arrested again for theft just 6 months after his release. So what's true? Well, Frank Abagnale was a con artist. That part is real. He did forge checks and steal from people. He was arrested multiple times. He did go to prison in France, Sweden, and the United States. He was released on parole in 1974. He did start a fraud prevention consulting business in 1976. He does give speeches and lectures. He did write books, and his autobiography was adapted into a very successful movie. But the scale of his crimes, the duration of his crime spree, the professional impersonations, the FBI relationship, the dramatic escapes, and most of the exciting details that make his story compelling, those appear to be fabrications or massive exaggerations. Here's what makes this whole thing so fascinating from a psychological perspective. Why would someone do this? Why would Frank Abagnale spend decades building up this elaborate mythology about himself, even when journalists kept poking holes in it? Let's think about the context of the 1960s, when Frank's actual crimes occurred. This was a different America. It was more trusting, more innocent in some ways. There were no computers verifying identities in real time, no credit checks, no instant background searches. If you showed up somewhere in a uniform with confidence and a good story, people tended to believe you. Authority figures, whether pilots, doctors, or police officers, were respected and rarely questioned. The systems that we take for granted today for verification simply didn't exist. In that environment, a certain kind of con was possible. Not the elaborate international schemes Frank claimed, but smaller cons, local cons. You could forge a check and cash it before anyone noticed. You could put on a uniform and bluff your way into places. You could lie on a job application and maybe get away with it for a while. Frank did some of this. He was a small-time grifter, taking advantage of a more trusting era. There's no shame in admitting that. It's actually interesting. But here's the thing about Frank's psychology. He came from a broken home. His parents divorced when he was a teenager, which by his own admission really messed him up. His father, who he idolized, went from being a successful businessman to struggling financially. Frank's identity was tied up in his father's success and approval. When that crumbled, what was left? There's a pattern with con artists, especially those who create false identities. They're often running from something, usually themselves. By becoming a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, Frank wasn't just scamming people. He was trying to become someone important, someone respectable, someone his father would be proud of. The con wasn't just about money, it was about validation. And here's where it gets really interesting. When Frank got out of prison in the mid-70s, he had a choice. He could disappear into obscurity, get a normal job, live a quiet life. Instead, he decided to monetize his past. But there was a problem. His actual criminal career was pretty mundane. A few forged checks, some petty theft, time in prison. That's not a compelling story. That doesn't sell books or get you on talk shows. So Frank did what he'd always done. He created a better version of himself. He took his small-time crimes and inflated them into an international adventure. He turned weeks into years. He turned hundreds into millions. He turned routine arrests into dramatic escapes. He created enemies who didn't exist and alliances that never happened. He built a mythology. And this time, he wasn't conning banks or corporations. He was conning all of us. The media, publishers, movie studios, audiences, everyone. And you know what? It worked. It worked brilliantly. Frank Abagnale, the mediocre criminal, became Frank Abagnale, the legendary conman. He got rich, he got famous, he got respect, he achieved everything he'd been chasing his whole life, not through actual genius-level crimes, but through storytelling, through the con of cons. Think about the victims in all of this, not the banks or corporations Frank claimed to scam, but the real people. Paula Parks and her family, who showed him kindness and got robbed for their trouble. The college women at the University of Arizona who were sexually violated by a man pretending to be a doctor. The family business in the Bronx that Frank stole checks from. These aren't faceless corporations. These are real people with real losses. And Frank's narrative for decades has been that he never hurt little people, that his victims were only big businesses. That's a lie. His actual victims were exactly the little people he claims he never touched. There's also a broader sociological question here. Why did we believe him? Why did we want to believe him? Part of it is that we love underdog stories. We love the idea of the clever individual outsmarting the system. There's something romantic about the con artist, especially when they're young and charismatic and eventually reform. We root for them because they represent a fantasy. The fantasy that you can reinvent yourself, that you can get away with it, that you can beat the odds. Movies like Catch Me If You Can feed into this. Spielberg's film is beautiful, entertaining, emotionally resonant. Leonardo DiCaprio makes Frank sympathetic. We understand his pain about his parents' divorce. We see him as a kid just trying to survive. Tom Hanks' Carl Hanratty becomes a father figure, giving Frank the guidance and structure he never had. The movie gives us a satisfying arc. Crime doesn't pay, but redemption is possible. It's a great story, but it's fiction. Or at least, it's much more fiction than we were led to believe. Spielberg made a movie based on Frank's autobiography, which was itself largely fictionalized. So we got a movie based on a book based on a lie. It's layers of deception, which is kind of perfect when you think about it. The other reason we believed Frank is that, until recently, it was hard to disprove him. In the 1970s and 80s, you couldn't just Google someone's criminal record. You couldn't pull up digital archives of old newspapers. You couldn't cross-reference prison records online. Fact-checking required physical legwork, phone calls, trips to archives. Most people didn't have the time or resources to do that, and the few journalists who did investigate Frank found contradictions, but they couldn't completely unravel the whole story. They'd publish their findings in local papers, but Frank would just keep moving, keep telling his stories elsewhere. The internet didn't exist to preserve and amplify those debunkings. But now we're in the information age. Everything is searchable. Everything is archived. Everything can be cross-referenced. And that's how Alan C. Logan was able to do what he did. Logan spent years methodically going through documents, many of them digitized for the first time, building an ironclad timeline of Frank's actual movements. And that timeline is devastating to Frank's narrative. Logan tracked down real victims like Paula Parks and gave them a voice. He found the prison records that prove Frank was incarcerated during his supposed crime spree. He documented every arrest, every court appearance, every actual crime Frank committed. And when you lay it all out chronologically, Frank's story falls apart. The math doesn't work. The timeline doesn't work. The claims can't be verified. It's smoke and mirrors. Logan's book came out in 2020, and it should have been a huge scandal. This is Frank Abagnale, one of the most famous con artists in American history, being exposed as a fraud about being a fraud. That's an amazing story. But you know what? It didn't get a lot of mainstream attention. Some articles were written, some podcasts covered it. But Frank is still out there giving speeches, still making money, still telling his stories. In 2022, something interesting happened. Frank was invited to Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, to receive a Heroes in Ethics Award and give the keynote speech at their annual Heroes of Professional Ethics series. Let that irony sink in. A man whose entire career is based on lying was given an ethics award. During the Q&A after his speech, a man named Jim Grinstead, who hosts a podcast called Scams and Cons, stood up and asked Frank point blank, in light of the ethics award you're receiving tonight, would you come clean? Would you tell the truth about the stories you've told? Will you admit that you lied to everybody and you're still conning them? Frank's response was to deny everything. He said he had nothing to do with his autobiography, the film, or the Broadway musical. He claimed other people created those stories, not him, which is demonstrably false, since we have video of Frank telling these exact stories on television years before his book was published. Xavier University, to their credit, removed all discussion of the event from their website shortly afterward. They realized they'd made a mistake. When journalists have asked Frank about Alan Logan's book and the evidence Logan presents, Frank has consistently refused to engage. He said, "I have not read the book, nor do I think it is worthy of a comment." That's his response to a meticulously researched book with hundreds of citations and documentary evidence. Not worthy of a comment. For some people, that refusal to engage is all the confirmation they need. If Frank could refute Logan's evidence, wouldn't he? But he can't, so he doesn't. There's a moment in Frank's 1981 interview that keeps coming back to me. When asked directly if he'd been lying about his accomplishments, Frank said, "Well, then I am the world's greatest con man. If I didn't do all those things and I've made all this money from advances, royalties, and speaking fees, then I am in fact the world's greatest con man." It was a joke, a deflection. But it might also be the truest thing Frank Abagnale ever said about himself. Because here's the ultimate irony. If Frank's real crimes were as small time as the evidence suggests, if he was just a petty forger and thief who spent most of his late teens and early 20s in prison, then his greatest con wasn't in the 1960s. It was afterwards. His greatest con was convincing the world he was a great con artist. He sold us a story. He sold it so well that Steven Spielberg bought it. Leonardo DiCaprio embodied it. Millions of people believed it, and Frank made millions of dollars from it. Is that genius? Or is that just another kind of fraud? Here's what we know for certain. Frank Abagnale was a criminal. He did forge checks. He did steal from people. He did impersonate others, at least briefly. He went to prison. He got out. He started a business. He wrote a book. He became famous. Those are facts. Here's what we also know. Most of the specific claims Frank has made about his crimes cannot be verified, and many have been directly contradicted by documentary evidence. His timeline doesn't work. His professional impersonations appear to be fabricated. His escapes didn't happen the way he said. His relationship with the FBI is vastly exaggerated, if not entirely fictional. His victims were not faceless corporations, but real people, including a family that showed him hospitality and young women he sexually violated under false pretenses. So what's the truth? Maybe the truth is that Frank Abagnale is exactly what he's always claimed to be, a con artist, just not the kind we thought. His greatest forgery wasn't a check, it was his own biography. His greatest impersonation wasn't a pilot or a doctor, it was the impersonation of a master criminal. His greatest escape wasn't from a prison or a plane, it was from accountability, from the truth, from the reality of who he actually was. There's something almost poetic about it. The man who claimed to have fooled Pan Am, the FBI, hospitals, and law firms actually did fool someone much bigger. He fooled us. He fooled Hollywood. He fooled history, at least for a while. And maybe, just maybe, he's still fooling himself. Because if you tell a lie long enough, if you build an entire life around that lie, if you get famous and rich and respected because of that lie, at what point does the lie become your reality? At what point do you stop being able to distinguish between the person you were and the person you invented? Frank Abagnale is in his late 70s now. He still lives in Charleston, South Carolina, with his wife Kelly. They've been married for decades. They have 3 grown children. By all accounts, he's been a devoted husband and father. His consulting business is still operating. He still gives occasional speeches, though probably fewer since Logan's book came out and universities started asking harder questions. In a way, Frank got what he always wanted. He escaped the mediocrity of his real crimes. He became someone important, someone famous, someone people want to hear from. He made his father proud, posthumously. He built a legacy. It just happens to be a legacy built on lies. The movie Catch Me If You Can ends with a title card telling us that Frank has been happily married for over 20 years, has 3 children, is still good friends with Joseph Shea in real life, and has been working with the FBI for decades, helping them catch criminals. It's a perfect Hollywood ending. Reformed criminal finds redemption through family and service. Fade to black. Roll credits. But real life doesn't have title cards. Real life has Paula Parks saying her mother's heart was broken. Real life has young women at the University of Arizona who were violated by a man playing doctor. Real life has families who opened their homes to Frank and got robbed. Real life has journalists who spent years trying to tell the truth while Frank kept cashing checks, literally and figuratively. Here's my question for you. Does it matter? Does it matter if Frank Abagnale's crimes were smaller than he claimed? Does it matter if his FBI work is exaggerated? Does it matter if the movie and the book are more fiction than fact? Some people would say no. They'd say it's just entertainment. It's a good story. Who cares if it's not 100% accurate? Enjoy the movie. Appreciate the legend. Don't overthink it. But I think it does matter. It matters because Frank made millions of dollars from his story. He's been paid huge speaking fees to talk about ethics and fraud prevention, ironic given that he's still apparently committing fraud about his own past. It matters because he claimed for years that he never hurt little people, only big corporations, when the evidence shows the opposite. It matters because his story has inspired countless articles, books, and media coverage about the genius con artist, giving him a glamorous reputation he may not have earned. And it matters because truth matters. In an era where misinformation spreads faster than ever, where people can build entire careers on fabricated stories, where social media allows anyone to create a fictional version of themselves, the Frank Abagnale story is a cautionary tale. Not about the dangers of con artists in the 1960s, but about the danger of unchecked narratives in every era, including our own. Frank Abagnale told us to catch him if we could, and for decades, we couldn't. Not because he was too fast or too clever, but because we weren't really trying. We wanted to believe. We wanted the story to be true. We wanted to root for the charming rogue who beat the system and then reformed. But Alan C. Logan did try. He caught the truth, or at least got a lot closer to it than anyone before him. And what he found was that the real Frank Abagnale is more interesting than the legend, just in a different way. He's not a criminal genius. He's a storyteller genius. He's not a master forger of checks. He's a master forger of his own history. In the end, maybe Frank Abagnale is the perfect con artist for the modern age. He understood something fundamental about how we consume stories. We don't want complexity. We don't want ambiguity. We want heroes and villains, even if our hero is a criminal. We want clear narratives with satisfying arcs. We want the movie version of life, not the messy, contradictory, document-filled reality. Frank gave us what we wanted. He understood that in America, your story is your currency. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be compelling. And if you tell it well enough, if you tell it long enough, if you get the right people to believe it, it becomes true in the way that matters most. It becomes the story everyone knows. So did we catch Frank Abagnale, or did he catch us? Did he con the world, or did the world willingly participate in the con because the alternative, the truth, was just too boring? I'll leave you with this. Frank Abagnale has lived several lives. The life he actually lived, the one documented in court records and prison files. The life he claimed to have lived, the one in his book and his speeches. And the life that Hollywood created, the one we saw on screen. three different versions of the same person, three different truths, or maybe two lies and one reality. The question is, which one do you believe? And maybe more importantly, why? Because in the end, the greatest trick Frank Abagnale ever pulled wasn't convincing the world he was a pilot or a doctor or a lawyer. It was convincing the world that any of it mattered more than the truth. And that, whether you admire it or despise it, is the mark of a real con artist. So the next time you watch Catch Me If You Can, enjoy it. It's a great movie. DiCaprio is fantastic. The soundtrack is perfect. Spielberg's direction is flawless. Just remember, you're not watching a true story. You're watching a con in action. You're watching what happens when someone realizes that the biggest score isn't money or fame, it's legacy. It's getting people to remember you not as you were, but as you wished you'd been. Frank Abagnale Jr. wanted to be extraordinary, and in a way, he succeeded. Just not in the way we thought. He became extraordinarily good at one thing, making us believe. And that, I suppose, is worth something, even if everything else was a lie.